The trauma bond, breaking the addictive cycle. So today I want to focus solely on tools and techniques one can use to break this really difficult repetitive pattern. What I'd like to do now is delve specifically into a case of a man who's looking to exit a trauma bonded relationship, and he turns to an online expert who says she has a lot of experience, although no specific credentials, but has a lot of experience in helping people get out of these really traumatic relationships. I want to actually capture this fellow's words because words are really important in my field. And then I want to show you two things. One, how this expert, this woman, advised this fellow based on what he was saying to her. And these are things I'm sure you've heard. If you've been doing your homework and you've been looking at social media content, all these things I think are going to sound very familiar to you, but I'm going to show you systematically, step by step, from my perspective, what's helpful and what's not helpful, and different ways that one may begin to think about what's happening to this fellow. Let's jump right in and I'll give you an example of what I mean, okay? He says, when I pulled away from this relationship, she wanted me back. I knew it was not healthy for me, but she would pull me back in, and she said, "You are the love of my life, and I want to heal and grow together." So I took her back. The expert said, "This is avoidant attachment. You are enmeshed in this relationship. This kind of relationship can make a person obsessed. It can make a person addicted. I understand how that happens. It happens to all of us." But she was very manipulative. She did this to you. Now, what I would have done differently is when she said, "You are the love of my life. I want to heal and grow together," I would have said to this fellow, or to you, or imagine saying this to your friend or somebody you know who's in this kind of situation, perhaps yourself. What did you imagine when she said that? What did you hear? What did you begin to picture? See, I'm saying all these things, like, what were you thinking? Did you begin to picture a life with her? What did you imagine that life would look like? You see, what I'm getting at here is sort of the essence of narcissism, which is the omnipotent self paired with, well, let me say the grandiose sense of self paired with an omnipotent other. Remember, the narcissist gets involved in a relationship with the fantasy that the other person is going to meet their needs. So I'm trying to get a little closer to your fantasy here. What is it you're imagining? Are you going to change this person in your life? See, this is what we call, again, in my field, in the field of psychoanalysis, this is what we call omnipotent control. That you have a fantasy that somehow you're going to be able to help this person change. You're going to convert them. And now we're working on something a little different, which is omnipotence. We're not really actively working on your decision about whether to go back or not. See, that's one of the differences. We go just below the manifest story, and we're trying to get into, like, what's the latent material here? Let me push on a little bit. Some months later, he tries to break off the relationship, but he gave her, what I heard from this case is what I would call an ambiguous message. He said, "Maybe we should break up." And the expert said, the online expert said, "But you're dealing with a vampire. If you want no contact, you have to declare it. You have to say no contact. You generate your own power." Now, here's what I would have done differently. Can you go over that again? What was it you said to her? And then I would have been curious, what sort of message do you think you gave her when you said, "Maybe we should break up"? You see, I think you can hear in my approach, I'm not telling him to have power, whether he has power or he doesn't have power. You know, this is like telling an adult you need to have boundaries, which is another very common suggestion in these situations. But I'm not talking to a grown adult about how they should have boundaries. You know about boundaries. And if you had the boundaries, you wouldn't be in this place in the first place, right? Like, you wouldn't be here. So I'm not telling you have boundaries, access your inner power. I'm not giving suggestions like that. Instead, what I'm trying to figure out is why the word maybe. If you or somebody you know is in this kind of situation where you're working with somebody who's telling you to have boundaries and have power, you may want to just ask yourself, how is that meant to really help me? How does that further my understanding of why I can't get out of this type of relationship? Just to continue, she sends a selfie from her first day back at work, and he replies, "You look good, but please, no contact." She says, again, the expert on this case says, you need to get a restraining order. And she focused on the woman's behavior. Again, it's almost like this is more about the woman than it is about him. And this is very common. In my online research, looking for specific strategies and tools, oftentimes the focus is on the narcissistic manipulator. This person is manipulative and lying, and they're hooking you back in. But there's very little understanding of oneself and their motivation, the pull, the desire to go back into these relationships. So she says, this woman, after you get the restraining order, it's the reason you need it is because she's trying to hook you back in. That's why she sent you that message. And then she goes on and she gives this little speech about this relationship is not love. And you've heard this before, and we all know this. Narcissists don't have loving relationships. If you want to know how to move a relationship from a narcissistic one to a more loving relationship, I've spoken about this quite extensively in my earlier videos. But I will never sit here and talk to somebody about this, because this is like giving a lecture or giving educational advice. Now, again, please don't misunderstand me. There is a place for education, like what we call psychoeducation. So there is a place for that, and there is a place for support. But if that's the only thing that's happening, or there's not a lot more, I would say that should comprise of maybe 10% of the work that's getting done. And if that comprises of more than, so far from what I've described, it's the majority of the work. So instead of telling someone to get a restraining order, I would have said, what happened there? What compelled you to send that text message to her? Please, no contact. What was going through your mind when you responded back and you said, please, while you were actually contacting her? You see, there's the irony. He said, please, no contact, but he's contacting her. Now, in my field, this is what we call intra-psychic conflict. This is a mind in conflict. And this is wonderful, by the way, because I've spoken quite a bit about how personality disorders, everything is ego syntonic, and our goal is to make it ego dystonic. In other words, that they begin to question it. Conflict is good. And when you see conflict, you want to bring it up and make it bigger and bigger. Because if you don't have conflict, then you just do things without really thinking them through. And that's how you end up back in these really abusive, toxic relationships, right? So, from my field, from my position, this is intra-psychic conflict. And now this is the nature of the work. I want to help him begin to understand how he's behaving in one way by sending these messages, and he feels a completely different way. In other words, he feels like this relationship is not good for me, but he's behaving in a way that's pulling her back in. So he says no contact as he's making contact, and that becomes the nature of the work. All right, listen, I hope you find this interesting. There's a lot more to say, but I want to wrap things up here. This is a really complicated issue. Personality disorders are complicated, first of all. Being involved with somebody with a personality disorder is complicated. And what now I'm suggesting, this is not to like blame the victim, but I hope it opens your mind to say, am I playing some role in this? And if so, why? Like with this fellow. You see, this woman, the expert, is looking at it all from the vampire, the other woman who's hooking you back in. But what she's failing to do is look at this fellow's own motivations. to go back in, his own conflict about it. And that's what needs to be front and center, in my opinion. Until next time, I'll see you then. Bye for now.